The girl trusted him because he spoke softly and promised her a small gift. It was late afternoon in a crowded market in Ambato, Ecuador, and vendors were still shouting prices over piles of fruit and cloth. Families moved through the aisles in clusters. He watched for the ones who drifted just far enough from their parents to be vulnerable. When he reached for her hand, it looked almost protective, like an older brother guiding a child through traffic. No one realized she was being led away. Pedro López had learned early how to survive by manipulation. Born in Colombia in 1948, he grew up in poverty after his father was killed during the period of violence known as La Violencia. His mother, overwhelmed and struggling, expelled him from the home when he was still a child. López later claimed he survived on the streets of Bogotá, where he said he was assaulted and exploited. As a teenager, he drifted between petty crime and institutions. He spent time in a reform school and later in prison in Colombia for theft. While incarcerated in Peru in the 1970s, he told investigators he killed other inmates who targeted him, though details remain disputed. What is not disputed is what happened after his release. By the late 1970s, young girls were disappearing across rural areas of Peru and Ecuador. They vanished from markets, village roads, and near schools. Most were between 8 and 12 years old. They came from poor indigenous families who had little access to police resources and often no ability to pressure authorities for answers. Reports were filed, but in many cases the disappearances were treated as runaways or isolated tragedies. The pattern was not immediately connected across borders. López traveled constantly. He moved between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, targeting isolated communities where children walked long distances alone. Witnesses later described a polite man who approached families under the guise of friendship. He blended in, watched routines, and waited for moments of separation. Once he isolated a victim, he led her into remote areas outside town. There, investigators later determined, he assaulted and murdered the child before covering the body with soil or brush. In 1978, authorities in Peru briefly detained him after suspicious behavior near children. He was released due to lack of evidence and reportedly warned to leave the area. He crossed into Ecuador, where his crimes intensified. In some villages, children began disappearing at a rate that alarmed local leaders, but coordination between regions remained weak. The break came in March 1980, when López attempted to abduct a girl from a market in Ambato. She resisted, and her mother intervened. Police arrested him on the spot. At first, he denied wrongdoing, presenting himself as a harmless traveler. Under questioning, his story shifted. Eventually, he began confessing. What followed stunned investigators. López calmly described killing dozens of girls in Ecuador and claimed the number was far higher across 3 countries. He led police to burial sites in remote areas. In Ecuador alone, authorities exhumed multiple shallow graves where he indicated. The remains matched missing children reports. He described the locations with precision, often identifying natural landmarks that guided search teams directly to the bodies. Officers later stated that he appeared composed and even proud as he recounted the crimes. During interrogation, López claimed responsibility for more than 300 murders across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. The exact number has never been verified. Authorities were able to confirm a fraction of that figure through recovered remains and cross-referenced reports, but the scale of the confessions made him one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history. Many families never recovered the bodies of their children, leaving gaps that will likely never be closed. In 1980, López was convicted in Ecuador for the murders of dozens of girls, with the court formally recognizing 53 victims within that country. Ecuadorian law at the time limited prison sentences. Despite the magnitude of the crimes, he received the maximum penalty available under the legal code, 16 years. He served his term in prison in Ecuador, where he continued to grant interviews and repeat his claims. In some accounts, he expressed no remorse. He described selecting victims based on vulnerability and isolation, reinforcing the calculated nature of his actions. In 1994, after serving his full sentence, Ecuador released him. He was transferred to Colombia, where he was briefly held in a psychiatric facility and later released due to a ruling that he had completed his sentence abroad. The decision triggered outrage among victims' families and international observers. López disappeared from public view. In 1998, Colombian authorities issued a new arrest warrant in connection with a separate homicide case, but he was not located. Reports over the years have alternated between claims of his death and sightings in remote areas. As of the last confirmed official statements, his whereabouts remained unknown. The damage left behind was immeasurable. Entire communities in rural Ecuador and Peru had lost multiple children. Parents who once allowed sons and daughters to walk to school alone began escorting them in groups. Markets that had once been lively gathering points carried a new tension. In court, investigators described how López targeted children who were unlikely to trigger large-scale investigations, exploiting systemic poverty and weak cross-border coordination. His case exposed significant gaps in law enforcement communication between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador during that period. Missing persons reports were not centrally tracked, and rural disappearances often failed to generate national attention. Only after his arrest did authorities begin to see the full pattern linking the crimes across 3 countries. The figure known as the Monster of the Andes became a symbol of unchecked predation moving through neglected spaces. While the exact total of victims remains debated, the confirmed graves and documented cases establish one of the deadliest known series of child murders in the Western Hemisphere. The investigation relied heavily on his own confessions, burial site identifications, and forensic recovery in remote terrain. Families of the victims have continued to demand accountability and transparency regarding his final status. For many, the most painful reality was not only the violence inflicted, but the brevity of the sentence imposed. 16 years for confirmed murders left a lasting scar on public trust in the justice system. Pedro López exploited borders, poverty, and indifference. He selected children who could not defend themselves and communities with limited institutional power. His arrest in a crowded market ended years of movement across the Andes, but it did not resolve the questions surrounding the full scope of his crimes or his final fate. Decades later, the graves he revealed remain documented evidence of a man who moved silently through villages and left devastation behind. The numbers he claimed may never be fully proven, yet the confirmed victims are enough to place his crimes among the most extreme serial child murders on record. The investigation that followed reshaped conversations about missing children in parts of South America and forced authorities to confront failures that had allowed a predator to operate for years. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.